We're delighted to have with us this morning Dr. Cheri Larsen Hoeckley. Dr. Larsen Hoeckley has taught in the English department here at Westmont since 1997, and she currently serves as chair of that department. She specializes in Victorian literature with research interests in gender, sexuality, and faith. She's applied those interests to curricular development and has been one of the driving forces behind our new, and I think it's fair to say, robust gender studies minor. Dr. Larsen Hoeckley holds degrees from UT Austin and UC Berkeley, where she received her doctorate. She's the editor of Shakespeare's Heroines and the author of numerous scholarly articles, including most recently, The Dynamics of Forgiveness and Poetics in Adelaide Proctor's Homeless. Those are the bare facts, but to them I'd add a personal note. Cheri is one of the people who taught me as a Westmont undergraduate what it might mean to take a liberal arts education out into the world. She was part of the faculty team for the semester that I spent abroad, traveling through Europe, encountering for the first time people who, in Garrison Keillor's memorable phrase, didn't understand me and didn't want to. To see that experience as an opportunity not for fear, but for empathy, to bring to bear on that interpretation the lenses of literature and language, these are things I reflect on a lot, even years later. Cheri has continued to provide those opportunities for students, leading some 7 abroad programs in her time at Westmont, and recently developing a program in Germany and Northern Ireland that takes as its themes conflict and peacemaking. Please join me in welcoming Cheri Larsen Hoeckley.
Thank you, Aaron, and thank you all for being here this morning. Aaron and his colleague and spouse, Kristen, remind me that I don't know how people can think we don't inculcate marketable skills and characteristics and aptitudes in people when so many of us are inclined to hire back our own alumni when we're looking for people we want to work with. So thank you, Aaron. I'm curious, before I start, to just get a show of hands of anyone in the room who might have heard of Adelaide Proctor before you saw the program this morning. People who know me, okay. That's kind of what I expected. It's not surprising. If you're not a Victorianist or a church historian, you probably haven't heard of her. Did any of you by any chance grow up singing the hymn, The Lost Chord? Okay, you're now just behaving like an obvious plant. I'm not even going to look toward that window anymore. That was actually a new one to me that I didn't know, but sometimes when I talk to my older church friends about Proctor, this is one that they connect with. Apparently that hymn that she wrote the lyrics to sometimes is still sung in some circles. Protestant circles, surprisingly, because she was a devout Catholic convert. And much of her literary work that has any kind of Christian overtone is rooted very much in a Catholic tradition. But I completely understand you may not have heard from her. You're going to know a little more in about 45 minutes. But before we do that, I want to step back a little bit. Mary was very helpful last night, I think, in laying out for us the 2 concepts that are organizing our conversation this weekend and that often don't find themselves in the same place or in the same conversation at the same time. And her definitions for those terms were helpful. Because they are unusual in putting together, I'm going to go ahead and walk through a couple of versions of working definitions that are going to motivate what I do as well, that you'll hear echoes of Mary's talk yesterday in, I think. They were just that good. And so I'm going to work with them. But I also shaped and structured these definitions because I was struck as I was thinking about social entrepreneurship and the liberal arts tradition by another female lecturer. Gosh, I just realized I'm going to just drop myself right in next to, and that's Virginia Woolf, who probably some of you have heard of. When she was asked by the Cambridge Women's Colleges to deliver a lecture on women in writing, she opened that lecture with a gambit wondering what they might have meant by women in writing. And Woolf comes up with this response saying, women in fiction might mean, and you may have meant it to mean, women and what they are like, one definition. Or it might mean women and the fiction that they write, second definition. Or it might mean women and the fiction that is written about them. Or it might mean that somehow all three are inextricably mixed together and you want me to talk about them in that light. Woolf's three-part structure for a definition, as well as her refrain, what a term might mean, and the space there for considering other possibilities, struck me as useful in approaching our terms for the weekend. And also in thinking about what Woolf does with these three definitions when she's got them up there. Women and what they might mean becomes for her the reductive response, or women and what they are like for her becomes the reductive response she finds when she goes looking for definitions of women and finds that it's all too often what men have said about women without ever actually listening to them. So that's one that she can fairly easily put to the side. And I think as we talk about the liberal arts and social entrepreneurship, there are also often, in thinking through these things, definitions that we want to put on the table so that we can say, no, that's not what we mean at all. And so let me get a couple of those out there. When we talk about liberal arts, we don't mean lefty artsy, right? This is not the degree that you are privileged enough to be able to get so that you can learn how to spurn the wealth that education will never allow you to gain, okay? Going and studying poetry and pottery making and guitar playing somewhere isolated where you're not connected to other things and you then somehow become a more beautiful and completely incompetent person, okay? That sort of caricature of the liberal arts is out there, and I think part of the reason these conversations are important is so that we can address it in some ways, but it's really not what we mean when we talk about that. A second definition that I actually think is helpful, but that I would want to complicate and nuance some ways, is the Trivium and the Quadrivium. That classical definition of the liberal arts is those 7 definitions that things have been tied to, okay? Rhetoric, grammar, logic, and the numeracy one is always slightly more difficult for me. Music, astronomy, arithmetic, and geometry, okay? The Trivium and the Quadrivium, the source of the disciplines that we teach now, of course, recognizable if we remember that they tie us to literacy and numeracy as a way of organizing and understanding the world. They're not disciplines that we teach very much anymore, though very often when I'm on a long flight and the person sitting next to me finds out that I'm an English professor, the conversation turns immediately to grammar, as if that is still somehow all that we do, or encompasses all that I do. But these disciplines remind us, I think, that though we are rooted in literacy and numeracy, the liberal arts is constantly evolving or changing in ways that we approach understandings of how literacy and numeracy are valuable for us and for our students in thinking about the world that we live in. I think the Trivium and the Quadrivium are particularly helpful because the Quadrivium reminds us that we don't simply mean the arts and the humanities and the social sciences when we talk about the liberal arts, that we're tied in the hard sciences as well. Chemistry, physics, biology, computer science increasingly are all part of a liberal arts degree on many of our campuses. So this one can be helpful. I would want to modernize this definition a little bit, and the one that I've come up with is interdisciplinary attention to thinking, writing, and reflection on human experiences, plural, and on the place of humans in the world in ways that free us not to be locked into narratives of the past, okay? So that we know them. We know we're connected to the Trivium and Quadrivium, but that's never going to be entirely what can define the many things that we are as the human community that come to our campuses. Of course, at this stage in Westmont's conversation on the liberal arts, a lot of good has been said and done about the liberal arts, to paraphrase Matthew Arnold. If some of these things are striking you as things you want to follow up on a little bit more, I would direct you to Bruce Kimball's lectures that are published by the Gady Institute and out on the table in the hallway. The discipline that I was trained in, English, didn't exist as a university discipline in the 1850s when Adelaide Proctor was writing. University students, who were all male, would have studied Greek and Latin for literacy and language training. English departments were an innovation at the turn of the 20th century. American literature as an academic discipline was an innovation in the early 20th century. So in the past few decades, when the liberal arts have moved to some of what has gotten us parodied very often, into interdisciplinary programs or ways of understanding our disciplines, like global studies, gender studies, sexuality studies, ethnic studies, peace and conflict studies, and environmental studies. We've simply been following in our tradition in some way, I think, where we have come from, and the fact that as we think about what it means to think about human experiences, we need to cross-fertilize and combine and do some things differently. That cross-fertilization of space and time, or that cross-fertilization of disciplines, requires space and time, both mental and physical space and time. And I do think this is one of the other things that often marks our liberal arts education, and that can make us, in many ways, vulnerable to that kind of parity, and actually vulnerable to legitimate critique about access. It's expensive to do. Though access continues to be a problem, access to our programs is actually much broader than some people who are adopting parts of our liberal arts campuses can actually claim for themselves. So much broader than what's going on in many privatized centers of thought, practice, and reflection. And I am struck by technology's desire to find affirmation in the importance of space and time by calling the places they locate themselves campuses. And what it means when they take on not only our terminology, but in many ways our architecture for innovating and creating and thinking. And recent coverage of the problems of hiring in diversity in a lot of these campuses, I think, reminds us that access is a problem not just for us, but our preservation of access for a not profit-driven motive is frequently important for the way that they innovate and create and train and think. This is the part where I'm supposed to say some of my best friends work for Google and Facebook. So this is not a personal attack, but I think as we think about institutions and the way that our traditions carry on, it's worth considering to think about the way that our traditions are picked up and carried on. It's actually not my best friends, it's my favorite nephew. Liberal arts institutions face dire challenges to our funding. We know that. And I would say those funding are caused in part by the need to keep up with the technology that's being innovated on those other campuses. But we risk losing space and time for activities that have no direct profit motive, for the thought that might be the seed of solutions to problems for profit motive, if we give up too much of that space and time, or if we let ourselves be looked at through too narrow a lens. Our campuses seek that deeper kind of tradition, that richer way of exploring and innovating, that we need to be able to tell our story better to hold on to. These ideas about time and space were concrete for me, and so to make them concrete, I just want to point out that in my role as department chair and coordinator of gender studies, I found myself struggling a little bit to find the space and time to finish this talk this week, and I was deeply grateful for this corner of our library where no one knew to look for me, that I could go with my laptop and make a little progress and start to get this done. So the ways that we think about all of our resources and what we do and as part of our tradition, not just what we teach, but how we teach it in relationship and in time and in collaboration and with the kind of luxury of space, I think are important in thinking about what we know here. And I would also say that they matter for how Proctor works as a case study for us. As I have learned about social entrepreneurship since the Gady Institute started thinking about this conversation, I've come to realize that one could actually also think about social entrepreneurship in some ways in this kind of three-part structure that Wolf gives us. What does it mean to talk about the kind of double or triple bottom line going on in these organizations and institutions without putting at least three of those definitions on the table seems to me to be a way of sort of underwriting some of what they've done and some of where they've come from and some of what they're trying to mean. So I would want to say that first we need to think about the possibility of social entrepreneurship in a definition that's been out there as any organization whose end in itself is a social good, regardless of business models. Okay, this is the traditional charity. And a lot of more recent thinking in social entrepreneurship clearly wants to say, no, we're not quite that. That's not a complex enough model for us to think about what's going on. It's not that there's anything wrong with traditional charities, it's just not exactly what we're talking about. I think that distinction is helpful to make clear. Sometimes traditional charities work into the conversation, but frequently there's something else going on. Putting that more problematic definition in the corner along with women and the things that are said about them and lefty artsy, I would move on to an organization that applies an entrepreneurial approach to addressing social issues and creating positive community change. Okay? So methodology has to matter here. What are we doing, or what is an organization doing in the way that it addresses its problems or supports itself or sustains itself as it thinks about doing social good? Then perhaps the third one, and the one that requires the kind of more complex problem solving that Mary was talking about, is an organization that generates profit to support a social good or to reinvest in the community. Okay? So the problem here is a double or a triple bottom line, one that thinks about social good as well as economics, or possibly environmental and social good as well as economics, and that can do that in a way that generates profit effectively to sustain itself. This is the Muhammad Yunus model, right? As with the definition for the liberal arts, then, we might have one definition that needs correcting, one definition that's helpful, and one definition I think that is perhaps richest and most directive in moving forward. This is not my field, and I don't think that's any secret, but just in case you were wondering, this is fairly new water for me to swim in. But as a scholar of literature and gender, I found it striking, as we started to talk about this particular conversation, how much the life of Adelaide Proctor, this poet who I have lived with for a while, can come to illustrate each of these three models, and in the way that her work brought her into contact with three different models of institutions that did social good, helped me to understand what the links might be between the liberal arts and social entrepreneurship. So I also think that she helps us realize that the three are somehow, as Woolf, to go back to the Woolf quote, the three are somehow all inextricably mixed together. So whether you want me to talk about them or not, to paraphrase Virginia Woolf, that's the approach that I'm going to take, that somehow when we look at Proctor, we realize we can't always separate these three. Let's go back and talk about her a little bit. Okay. Adelaide Proctor was born in 1825 as a young woman of privilege into a very lively, middle-class, very literary household. Her father was a poet who wrote under the pseudonym Barry Cornwall. Her mother, Anne Skepper Proctor, dedicated herself to being sure that all of her children, both sons and daughters, had a very well-rounded education and came into constant contact with the literary and political luminaries who she made a project to entertain in her own house so that she could have a lively and connected social circle. Oops, I'm supposed to be somewhere else, they think. Sorry about that. One of the prominent Victorians to visit the Proctor household is maybe, again, another figure who's known to you, and now who I have lost. Let's see if I can. This guy, okay. Charles Dickens was a regular dinner companion of Proctor's growing up, so much so that when she decided she wanted to try her hand at getting her poetry accepted to the most central Victorian publications, and so she submitted to Dickens' earlier periodical publication, Household Words, she chose the pseudonym Miss Berwick. And Dickens accepted her poems and published them for a little over a year and a half before Proctor ever actually revealed who her identity was. It was long enough that he and the staff at Household Words had the time to frame an entire narrative of who this woman was that in no way matched the woman whose poetry they were actually accepting. Okay. They had her down as a lovelorn governess, probably living on the continent somewhere and badly in need of money, and so trying to sell her poetry. Dickens tells this story in the biographical narrative that he wrote for Proctor's posthumous publication of her poetry. And it's a narrative that has very much, I think, shaped reception of Proctor, simplified her life and the complexity of her poetry in a way that has probably contributed to keeping her out of the canon. For instance, in a very Dickensian tale, it's an 11-page biography. Proctor was single for her entire life. 7 of Dickens' 11 pages locate her at a wedding in Italy that she attended when she was staying with her aunt, in a very Dickens move, so that he can think about her in a system of marriage as a woman, even though it wasn't a system she ever fit herself in, but it gives her a narrative of telling her. That leaves 4 pages to talk about the other kinds of things that actually make her life interesting and complicated, and he doesn't do very many of those. So for Her poetry had been accepted to Household Words and then also eventually to All the Year Round. It was also accepted into Good Words, other fairly prominent Victorian journals, and then eventually, under her own leadership, began to be published in the journal, the only poet to be published in the journal, the English Women's Journal, a Victorian periodical written for and circulated among women and sympathizers in the women's rights movement. This journal came out of an organization founded and fostered by Proctor and several of her younger female friends. Female friends who it's a little bit difficult to get photographs of at this point, but here are a few of Proctor's coterie at the Langham Place Circle. These were women who called themselves political economists or women's rights activists. There on the far end, you have Emily Faithfull, who I'll tell you about a little bit, who came on and started running the Victorian Press. In the middle is actually the central figure of the Langham Place Circle, Barbara Lee Smith Bodeshan. Bodeshan was also an artist. That's a self-portrait. It is very difficult to get a portrait of the younger female Bessie Rayner Parks. There are many more pictures of her as an older woman, but they just didn't fit in the set, so I didn't even work the image in. Parks and Bodeshan were really the motivating engine behind the Langham Place Circle and getting the set done. And then to the far end, standing in that picture, is Matilda Hayes. Matilda Hayes left Langham Place when she went to follow her partner, the actress Charlotte Cushman, who was sitting there on an American tour. Cushman is much better known and remembered. It's very difficult to find a picture of Hayes where she's not with Cushman, her better remembered partner. Okay. So these people all came together at Langham Place around a series of activities dedicated to innovating around women's social position in Victorian London. Proctor joined them and took on roles such as the clerk for the Society for the Promotion of the Employment of Women and editing Victoria Regia, and I'll tell you a little bit more about both those things when we move there. She maintained both her humorous productivity and her commitment to Catholicism while she was working with this women, and seemed to become kind of the animating spirit of the place, Matilda Hayes calls her in a memoir. She stayed there working, doing mid-level clerical work, and agitating for women's rights until her diagnosis of consumption became so serious that she had to retire to her bed. She died in 1863, quite likely from tuberculosis that she contracted, not at Langham Place, but when she was working with the poor in East London neighborhoods. So her literary legacy has been largely ignored, and you all think you were a very good representation of the fact that that's true. We don't know about her much if you're not a Victorianist or a historian of women and gender. But she was highly popular in the Victorian period. The poet Coventry Patmore insists that she sold more poetry than Tennyson did for a few years in the 1850s. She published only 3 volumes, 2 that were titled Legends and Lyrics, and 1 that was titled A Chaplet of Verses. And I want to talk a little bit more about A Chaplet of Verses this morning. That'll be really where we focus. Frequently, her imagery and her techniques comment on injustice in law, in economics, and in the established church, while presenting poetry in a way that is deeply palatable for a middle-class readership. My title is intentional in placing Proctor alongside these women. Her place in that circle matters very much for our conversations today. In 1850, when Proctor joined with these women, several of them were attending lectures at Queen's College in London. That was the only access to higher education that they had. Okay. In the history of women in higher education, let's not forget that Oxford and Cambridge were still closed to female students. In fact, when the Langham Place Circle broke up due to deaths and marriages and journeys on the continent and elsewhere, the remaining associates turned their energy toward the founding of Girton and Newnham at Cambridge. And so the first women's colleges were actually a legacy of Barbara Lee Smith and Bessie Rayner Parks. That's the colleges that invited Virginia Woolf to give her lecture a room of one's own. In the interval, while they were working at Langham Place, they used that space to create something like the environment that we have now on many of our liberal arts campuses. They established a reading room. They made sure that there was coffee and a place for people to work and talk and write and think and collaborate and innovate and organize and agitate. And those kinds of energies came out of this office for the first time, in some cases in central London, available to a collaborative of women alone. And they had a taste of what a campus might be like in many ways, and spurring each other on to learn and read and write and think. And out of that came 3 projects that I want to be sure we talk about a little bit today, that Proctor was related to in 3 ways. The first one was an organization that many of the women supported simply with their funds. Proctor, it's clear, volunteered quite a bit of her time at the Providence Row Women's Night Refuge in East London. In fact, you can still see, if you're ever in Spitalfields, this building is still there, and you can notice it by the door that was served. For a brief moment, this was a men's and women's night shelter, and so they had separate entrances on either side of the building. The lintel for the men's entrance is gone, but you can still see the women's entrance. It's university housing now. Providence Row was important in London because it was the first homeless shelter open to Catholic women. And in the history of, the history of race relations in 19th century England, Catholic women would generally have been Irish women and would have been figured and thought of as ethnically other. So the ability to have a shelter that welcomed them in, that allowed them to practice Catholic worship, was a new thing. It made space for them outside the parish relief system, where Catholic women could sometimes be admitted, but they would need to practice Protestant devotions with the rest of the community. Providence Row was run by the Sisters of Mercy. Proctor had a biological sister who was a member of the Sisters of Mercy. That helped to keep costs down. It also helped Proctor to align herself with them very often. Her spiritual director was also the priest who was in charge of Providence Row. We know that she gave the money. We also know that the proceeds from her book, A Chaplet of Verses, which I'll talk about a little bit more, was entirely dedicated to supporting Providence Row, even beyond her death. There are notes that are there that meant that money went there. Her monetary support for Providence Row was significant enough that there was a bed in the refuge named the Adelaide Proctor bed. So the marks are there that she found this charitable institution, that the things she was learning about women and economics and the vulnerability of the homelessness through the Langham Place Circle made her support of Providence Row particularly crucial for her. The second entrepreneurial venture that she engaged in out of Langham Place was, I kid you not, Spew. And this is not for you Hermione Granger fans about elves. It's an earlier Spew. It makes me wonder if J.K. Rowling actually knew about these women. The Society for the Promotion of the Employment of Women. Sometimes that meant the emigration of women, sending people overseas to places where women were needed for employment, but often more practical local employment for women. Proctor collaborated with Jessie Boucherette on trying to figure out how to make models for middle-class women available when really governessing was about the only opportunity they had, and it was a very insecure professional opportunity. So through Langham Place and the Society for the Promotion of the Employment of Women, Proctor and Boucherette collaborated and opened a law copying office and got many of their parents' legal friends to have their law copying done by women who were trained actually to be competent copyists in the legal service. Remember, this meant all legal documents were being written out by hand. They also opened the Victoria Press, run by all-female compositors, to employ women in printmaking and to then be able to drum up employment from the literary circles that they knew and that they were connected to for printing and for the press. Okay. Spew was clearly, that's to say, a business that was doing social good, but it was one that thought about an entrepreneurial model toward figuring out what to do with this problem of women who could not employ themselves and were therefore vulnerable to abusive husbands, Proctor knew, through marriage law reform, or to ending up in life on the street. Okay. In an outgrowth of her work with Spew, Proctor became the editor of Victoria Regia. Okay. And this was a moment in the life of the Victoria Press and the Langham Place Circle where there actually was an effort to generate profit and bring it back into the sustaining of the offices. The Victoria Press was the all-female compositors, and Proctor, Boucherette, Emily Faithfull got the idea that if they could put out a beautiful enough anthology, and this was a Victorian phenomena of the Gift Annual, they came out every year at Christmas, illustrated books of poetry that people would buy and distribute to their families and friends. If they could put one together that was beautiful enough and packed with well enough connected, well-known enough literary poets that they could generate some money for the press, and also connect with poets, writers, publishers who needed a press and be able to drum up some more business for the press. So Proctor used her skills to coerce poetry from Alfred Lord Tennyson, Coventry Patmore, Anthony Trollope, William Makepeace Thackeray, Matthew Arnold, Leigh Hunt, Harriet Martineau, and then got people to contribute their illustrations and generated this gift annual done by the press to continue to publicize the work that was coming out of Langham Place, employing women, giving women better economic opportunities, contributing to social stability in Victorian London. These are all kinds of comments that come up in the letters for the goals they have and the things that they hope for. Okay. I think, though, if we look at Proctor's life at Langham Place, I'm going to go back for a minute. The bullet point approach doesn't quite cover the way that she was intervening in the lives of the women around her or using her education and her literacy to try to do social good. It doesn't quite uncover all that the Langham Place Circle might give us as a case study in the liberal arts, that's to say. And so I want to look at one last project for her, and that was her devotional text, A Chaplet of Verses. A Chaplet of Verses was a devotional text, and in part because it was deeply Catholic, marked by Catholicism in its language, in its imagery, to some degree in its form, certainly in its content, and a way that made this poetry other for the majority of an English readership who Proctor knew she needed to sell the text to. A Chaplet of Verses in many ways for Proctor demonstrates the complex problem that Mary was talking about yesterday. It's not just complicated. Not only is it not simple, it's not just complicated, it's complex. Proctor was facing a lot of changing possible goods here and a lot of need to control the uncontrollable in terms of what other people might have been imagining about the content of her poetry, or at least to work with the uncontrollable when she came up with this decidedly Catholic book of poetry. She also faced the problem of how a bottom line might be complicated, because A Chaplet of Verses is the book of poetry that Proctor collected specifically to raise money for Providence Row Women's Night Refuge. Profits mattered to her at this point, and she had to do the economic cost-benefit analysis to see how she could generate the most funds to support these women. The problem she ran into is she wanted to be able to use the Victoria Press for that. They were slow, they were expensive, they weren't as necessarily well-trained. Waste went sometimes into the product of getting these women's work out into the public. And she had to make she had to do a cost-benefit analysis that weighed to her important but different social goods. The homeless women of Providence Night Row, or the employable women of Victoria Regia. The people who were seen, she knew, as the not deserving poor, or the women who were seen as the deserving poor. And where was she going to be able to generate the most good in this project? In the end, she chose, probably a little bit pressured by her publishers at Longmans, not to use Victoria Press, to put the book out with a cheaper press and to generate as much money as she could from A Chaplet of Verses. But the decision-making process that comes through in her letters to Barbara Lee Smith, Anna Jameson, and Bessie Rayner Parks, who were all her collaborators at Langham Place Circle, makes clear that she's thinking economically, but she's also thinking simultaneously about various social goods as she tries to figure out how this work can best help people, help the women at Providence Row, and help to some degree in reimagining the women at Providence Row. And it's the reimagining that I think comes through most clearly for me in thinking about complex problems and the contributions that the liberal arts might make to social entrepreneurship. Let's not forget, that's to say, that in all of its circumstances of composition and coming into materiality, A Chaplet of Verses is still a book of poetry. So while engaging in these various ventures, Proctor was also clearly deeply concerned about how her reading public might come to reimagine the women at Providence Row. Making money to support them was one thing. Helping the public around them rethink who they were so that there could be a social good of a more collaborative environment with the women of Providence Row, or from the women of Providence Row, is clearly part of what Proctor is trying to work out in A Chaplet of Verses. So let's take a minute and read a poem, shall we? I was torn between saving paper and my knowledge that some people like to mark up poems. So there probably aren't enough of these to go around, but here are a few of them, and I hope all of you can see it up here now. As it's going around, and if you want to look on the screen, let me just read this for you. One of the things I want to be sure I make clear is, yes, this is a very simple form. It's a ballad form. In some ways, this might be a poem that literary critics want to resist, and in fact they have, for saying that there's just not enough there. I actually think if you pay very much attention, it very much bears rereading, which ought to be what we demand of a literary text. It is cold, dark, midnight, yet listen to that patter of tiny feet. Is it one of your dogs, fair lady, who whines in the bleak, cold street? Is it one of your silken spaniels shut out in the snow and the sleet? My dogs sleep warm in their baskets, safe from the darkness and snow. All the beasts in our Christian England find pity wherever they go. Those are only the homeless children who are wandering to and fro. Look out in the gusty darkness, I have seen it again and again, that shadow that flits so slowly up and down past the window pane. It is surely some criminal lurking out there in the frozen rain. Nay, our criminals all are sheltered. They are pitied and taught and fed. That is only a sister woman that has got neither food nor bed. And the night cries sin to be living, and the river cries sin to be dead. Look out at that farthest corner where the wall stands blank and bare. Can that be a pack which a peddler has left and forgotten there? His goods lying out unsheltered will be spoiled. His goods lying out unsheltered will be spoilt by the damp night air. Nay, goods in our thrifty England are not left to lie and grow rotten, for each man knows the market value of silk or woolen or cotton. But in counting the riches of England, I think our poor are forgotten. Our beasts and our thieves and our chattels have weight for good or for ill, but the poor are only his image, his presence, his word, his will. So Lazarus lies at our doorstep, and Dives neglects him still. Proctor was rhetorically very gentle with her readers. And so much of the connection she's making in reimagining happen obliquely here. And I think that's important to acknowledge. And yet, there are challenges to her readers in this case, challenges that many Victorians would have picked up. What happens when the night cries sin to be living and the river cries sin to be dead? And Proctor is reminding her readers of the high numbers of women who drown themselves in the Thames rather than return to families after they had been seduced or return to their seducer after they had been abused, to use Victorian language. Awareness of the sexual double standard in Victorian England that made it perfectly acceptable for men to have extramarital sex and socially completely isolating for women to even be thought to have had extramarital sex. And so Proctor is challenging the narrative here in some way, certainly the narrative of sin and sexuality, the narrative of economics of sexuality as well, in the way that means that women are more vulnerable on the street. And I'm looking forward to Rachel's talk later in the way these links between social entrepreneurship and sex trafficking have carried forward for us. Or the need for social entrepreneurship, because many of these concerns in human trafficking are still real for us today. But Proctor challenges her readers in many ways, including in trying to think about what it might mean in a slide from Christian England as one self-perception to thrifty England as another self-perception. And what does it mean when her readers may not want to think of themselves as people who only see the economic bottom line, much more likely to think of themselves as Christian England. But in fact, when you look at how they spend their time or what they do or where they are making ethical judgments, their ethics seem to be much more driven by their ability to behave as thrifty England. So the juxtaposition of the ways that she talks about her audience there are important. There is much, much more to say about reimagining in this poem and the things that can be done. And I hope that we'll have a little bit of a chance to talk about them, but the combination of thinking particularly about women's economic vulnerability on the street and in a dual space about her readers and their need to do some rethinking and reimagining and perhaps be liberally educated from narratives that have driven their past are part of the kinds of things that I suspect you're imagining in many ways that were there. If this were a class and we had more space and time, I would have simply said, what are you noticing? And we would have talked about that a little bit more. But I want to talk a little bit about Proctor's Project for Imagination in wrapping up here and some of the things that I think come up there. And of course, we can't say the term narrative imagination anymore without thinking about Martha Nussbaum, particularly in Cultivating Humanity, but more recently and in a more streamlined version in her 2010 work, Not for Profit, Why Democracy Needs the Humanities. Nussbaum offers this definition of narrative imagination, and that is the ability to think what it might be like to be in the shoes of a person different from oneself, to be an intelligent reader of that person's story, and to understand the emotions and wishes and desires that someone so placed might have. Okay. This is narrative empathy. What's it mean to read a story and put ourselves in that person's shoes? Okay. But it's slightly more than narrative empathy, as Nussbaum talks about it. And this is, of course, where the other disciplines of the liberal arts matter. I was a great sympathetic reader as a college freshman. I read voraciously as a kid. I actually wanted to imagine other people's stories. Okay. But my sympathy very often meant that other people's stories looked a lot like mine, located in another place and time. Okay. And the interdisciplinarity and the integration of the liberal arts matters here to carry out those other parts of of Nussbaum's definition. That was a Freudian slip. I think to be an intelligent reader of that person's story, not simply to be a voracious reader of that person's story, to be an informed reader of that person's story, to understand their social and cultural context. Also to understand the limits of our ability to put ourselves in that person's place. Okay? That a fictional attachment to another person's story is still a fictional attachment to another person's story, and that with empathy ought to come a certain humility of the constant limits of our own imagination in other people's stories. Okay. So I want to push, Proctor really is trying to convey for her readers the lives of people on a London street who they may never have thought of. The homeless women, children, peddlers, okay, who they might almost not see if they can't imagine them, and to challenge them to bring those stories back into contact with their own. Nussbaum's narrative sympathy, that's to say, I think matters, but I actually think a liberal arts education, in the way it draws on the imagination, demands a little more than sympathy from us. And so I want to think a little more broadly about narrative imagination than even Nussbaum does. And a couple of other people who have been important for that. One of them, if you don't know Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's TED Talk, The Danger of a Single Story, you should, soon. And I am not a major TED Talk fan, but I don't watch a lot of TED Talks, that's to say, but this one, I think for a lot of people has been very, very formative, certainly a lot of students. In Proctor, that ability to imagine a story or a single story is thinking about how certain people might be able to hold on to Christian England if that's the only narrative they have of themselves. But if actually we hear the voices of the peddler, the child, the sister woman, we come to realize that Christian England is not perhaps so much Christian as it is thrifty. Okay? And what does it actually mean to listen to that story of the sister woman, the peddler, the child? How will we have to come to understand our story differently by opening up to other voices and other stories? Okay. And of course, on our campuses, one of the things that we hear if we resist the danger of the single story is our students who suddenly realize that person who looks like me actually knows my story. My story is valid in a way that it hasn't been before because I might have thought there was only a single one. And Adichie is very eloquent and actually quite witty on talking about those encounters with stories that were not hers, and then stories where she was able to locate herself in some way. So I would argue that a narrative imagination makes us aware of the danger of single stories and the need for global studies or queer studies or ethnic studies on our campuses to help people locate themselves in those other stories. Mary's talks also had me thinking about the danger of our own programs accepting the single story in some way, and that is the single story of the profit-making institutions. Okay? The danger of the single story in our institutions at this moment can allow us to accept that the problem of students carrying $30,000 in student loan debt is our problem, or one that we've generated, when in fact it's a problem that's come out of corporate America, one might easily argue, by making sure that student loan interest rates are never lowered when they could be lowered, or by driving for-profit education institutes where students carry the burden of that student loan debt. And so I've also been thinking about the liberal arts needing to think about the many stories that are told about us and who tells them and whether or not there's power in those stories, and our need to speak back our own story to those sometimes rather dangerous public narratives. Again, extending Nussbaum and learning from Proctor, I would extend narrative imagination beyond sympathy to include the counterfactual. And the counterfactual, again, can take us back to Woolf. Perhaps one of the most famous instances of the counterfactual in British literature is her story of Judith Shakespeare. Frustrated by her inability to find women who have written before her, Woolf goes back and imagines one and finds herself thinking, what if Shakespeare did have a sister? And what if she were bright? And what if she wanted to write? What would her life look like? It doesn't end well for Judith Shakespeare, but Woolf is able to imagine what that life might be like in some way. And in part because Virginia Woolf imagined it, women in literary studies have been able to go back and find those women empowered by that possible imagination. The Marjorie Kemps and the Julian of Norwiches, who wrote long before Shakespeare did and who shaped an English sensibility. And not only that, but challenged by Woolf to think about the women writers who Woolf was not able to see because of her particular commitments to class and privilege. People like Adelaide Proctor and Mary Prince. And then also the women who are writing now beyond Woolf's life, who we can't hold her responsible for, but who are able to see themselves in that counter-narrative. So the counter-narrative or the counterfactual is the story that doesn't actually exist, but that might exist. And these often are very productive in our classrooms. Mary was talking about them again yesterday in her comments about questioning the status quo or considering why it has to be that way, right? And one counterfactual that I have found incredibly productive for students on this campus recently and in this moment is to ask them in a way that we can hear, what would happen if every congregation in America agreed to host a Syrian family? What would that look like? Why is that not something we can do? How might we think history differently than we're told is going to happen? Okay. Of course, one of the things that counterfactuals can help us with is all the reasons that would be disastrous, right? Not every congregation in America is culturally, intellectually, socially prepared to host a Syrian family. But if we don't start with the counterfactual, sometimes we can't get to those places in thinking about what we might consider social problems that actually might be invitations to a richer social culture, a healthier social culture. I also think that part of what Nussbaum leaves out a little bit is the way that fiction allows us to take vicarious risks. Okay? If we can imagine something with somebody else, we can often do things that we wouldn't do in our own life. And again, I would go back to the way that Proctor has women thinking about, readers thinking about the possibility that they might welcome people into their own home. When for a Victorian middle-class housewife, because of the sexual double standard, aligning herself with a woman who might be a prostitute from the street could be the first step in a slippery slope to her own life on the street. Okay? But imagining that for Proctor in ways where it works out for women is one of the first kinds of vicarious risks that fiction can help us do. And also, I think, sets students up for the much more safer risks we often ask them to take in our classroom, but that feel like risks to them. And this, again, was Mary's thoughts in thinking about practicing in failure. Okay? So write that draft, and then figure out what you're going to do with it later. It could be, to use Anne Lamott's word, a really shitty first draft, okay? But what difference does it make? It's first draft. Risk it. Try it. Figure it out, okay? Speak that thing to your writing partner. even though they might get angry with you. So your writing partner is going to get angry with you. This is not the edge of the world. And for some of our students, someone being angry with them is the biggest possible risk they can imagine, right? But carrying that out in an adult environment in a way that prepares them for coworkers who might be angry at them, for instance. I think is some ways of practicing risks that give us a sense of how these things might be useful. And thinking about the kinds of risks that we often lead our students into in small ways, but that give them some of the aptitudes and characteristics that can make them certainly more successful employees or contributors to the social good in some ways. I also think about the ways that we take our own risks in innovating and in developing new parts of our cultural campus, whether that be in social entrepreneurship or in global studies, or in peace and conflict studies, or in gender studies, or in queer studies, or in ethnic studies, and redefining the things that we do in ways that haven't always been broadly popular, but that have allowed us to connect what we know and what we do well with the questions that students are currently asking and want to engage in and need to engage in thoughtfully, and that in fact our culture needs us to help them engage in. So I would want to add liberal arts faculty and students to the list of cultural innovators that we talk about. I will admit that one of the things we don't do, perhaps, where a partnership with social entrepreneurship would be helpful for us, is we don't market very well. I don't think we're very good at telling our story or thinking about our story. And so for those of you in the room who are practitioners, we're just not very good at this. About the best we can do is there an app for that? And so is there some way that I think we could find a partnership between the liberal arts and social entrepreneurs that allow us to work into the social good by thinking better about what we have to offer that we think other people want, and that actually when they get to us, they know we do want, but we can't offer perhaps in as large a circle as we can. These practices for thinking and innovating and renovating and talking and coming together and having the space for that is really the reasons that so many of us at Westmont who come back to this conversation every year are glad that you take the time to come to this space and have these conversations with us. So thank you for the part in that, and I'm going to sit down and let the conversation keep going now.